Broadcast on decaying frequencies for 10,000 years, a single rule was etched into the galactic bedrock: let the soul system sleep. Rather than a threat, this was a strict quarantine established because humanity had grown tired of breaking the universe. This warning held for millennia, while empires rose and choked on their own ashes, with nobody daring to knock on Earth's door. That isolation ended when the Krell went looking for a new labor force and cracked the vault. Expecting to find docile relics, they found humanity instead, and the sleepers woke up nursing a millennial hangover. Waking up from deep slumber doesn't feel like opening your eyes after a good night's rest. It feels like being dragged backward through a wood chipper made of ice. Jeffrey Cole's first sensation was the smell. Ammonia-burnt copper and the undeniable stench of his own stagnant biology. Then came the pain. It didn't announce itself with a heroic surge of adrenaline. It crept in through his marrow, a deep, aching throb that made his teeth chatter so violently he thought his jaw would splinter. He tried to gasp, but his lungs felt like they were coated in frozen fiberglass. Cole coughed, hacking up a mouthful of viscous blue preservation gel. It spilled down his chin, warm and thick-tasting like battery acid and old pennies. He couldn't see. The world was a blur of harsh, sterile white and the sickly yellow of emergency lighting. Sector 4. Maintenance. The thought drifted through his sluggish brain. He was an engineer, not a soldier, not a diplomat. He was the guy who fixed the atmospheric scrubbers when they started making that rhythmic thumping noise. He was supposed to sleep until the automated sensors detected a habitable exoplanet or the sun swallowed the Earth. Instead, a shadow fell over him. It wasn't a medical drone. The shape was wrong, too tall, too angular. Two sets of articulated mandibles twitched in the hazy light, clicking together with a sound like wet stones grinding. The creature was encased in a dull gray carapace that looked organic, but gleamed like metal. It smelled of rotting citrus and wet chalk. A Krell. Cole didn't know the name yet, of course. To his freshly thawed, oxygen-starved brain, it was just a giant, terrifying bug in a flak jacket. It reached into the pod. Its grip on his shoulder was paralyzing. 3 thick, jointed fingers dug into his collarbone, hauling him upright with a casual, terrifying strength. Cole didn't resist. He couldn't. His muscles were practically gelatin. He flopped forward his bare feet, hitting the grated floor of the cryo bay. The metal was freezing. He registered the texture of the grating little diamond-shaped ridges digging into the soft soles of his feet, and it was the most real thing in the room. Around him, the bay was a nightmare. Thousands of pods lined the curved walls of the sleeper ship Borealis, stacked like coffins in a mausoleum. Hissing vapor poured from hundreds of them. The intruders were prying them open with heavy, brutal tools. No delicate revival sequences. They were jamming crowbars into the pneumatic seals and ripping the glass away. Cole heard vomiting. A lot of it. The wet, wretched sounds of humans voiding empty stomachs. A woman 2 pods down from him, Davis. He thought her name was worked in hydrobotanics, slid to the floor in a puddle of her own thaw gel, weeping uncontrollably, her hands clutching her head. A Krell soldier nudged her with the butt of a heavy kinetic rifle. When she didn't get up, it kicked her in the ribs. The sound of her bones snapping echoed sharply over the hiss of venting gases. Cole flinched, his stomach twisting. He didn't lunge to help her. He didn't yell at the alien. He just pulled his knees to his chest and shivered, trying to make himself as small as possible. The hero instinct is a myth. When a person is naked, freezing, and outnumbered by armored giants, biology screams only one word: hide. His captor yanked him by the hair, forcing his head up. A device was shoved into his ear. It felt like a cold, sharp insect burrowing into the canal. A burst of static exploded behind his eyes, followed by a synthesized metallic voice grinding into his auditory nerve. Biped 884-A, you are conscripted. Stand. He tried. His knees buckled immediately. Cole collapsed, scraping his shin against the open edge of his pod. Blood welled up bright and startlingly red against his pale, frostbitten skin. The Krell clicked its mandibles, an expression of annoyance Cole guessed, and simply grabbed him by the back of the neck, dragging him toward the central corridor. His bare feet dragged across the grated floor. The pain in his shin throbbed in time with his frantic, irregular heartbeat. Cole kept his eyes locked on the floor, watching the droplets of his own blood smear across the metal, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of his reality. They weren't saved. They were salvaged. They threw the humans into Cargo Hold C. It was a cavernous space originally designed to hold terraforming equipment. Now it was a holding pen. The air was stale thick with the smell of hundreds of unwashed, terrified, and freshly thawed humans. The Krell hadn't bothered to give them clothes. A few people had managed to grab thermal blankets from the emergency kits before being herded out of the cryo bay, and they huddled together in tight, shivering knots. Cole sat against a cold bulkhead, his arms wrapped tightly around his legs. The rust on the wall felt rough and powdery against his bare back. He was numb. The sheer absurdity of the situation hadn't fully processed. His brain kept misfiring, feeding him mundane thoughts. He forgot to clear the cache on his terminal before the freeze. Did he leave his boots in locker 42 or 43? Hey, a raspy voice broke through his mental static. Cole turned his head slowly. It was Turner. He was a shift supervisor from Sector 7. He looked terrible. His skin was mottled with purple bruises, and his left eye was swollen shut. He smelled strongly of vomit and fear sweat. "Cole," he rasped, coughing into his hand. You got any idea what's happening?" "No," Cole croaked. His throat felt like sandpaper. "Aliens, Turner. I think they're aliens." Turner let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Figures. 10,000 years, and the first thing we meet is a bunch of giant, pissed-off cockroaches." He leaned his head back against the bulkhead, his good eye scanning the room. "They're sorting us." Cole followed his gaze. At the far end of the cargo hold, a raised platform had been erected. Krell guards stood at intervals, their heavy rifles resting casually in their segmented arms. In the center stood a Krell that looked slightly different. Its carapace was adorned with jagged red markings, and its posture was rigidly upright. It was using a handheld device to scan the humans as they were shoved forward in a ragged line. "They're taking the young ones," Turner whispered, his voice trembling. "The ones with muscle. They're scanning bone density or something. The older ones. The weak ones." He pointed to a smaller door on the left side of the platform. "They take them through there. I haven't seen anyone come back." Cole's stomach tightened. He was 42 when he went into the ice. Not old, but his joints ached from years of crawling through ventilation shafts, and his diet had consisted mostly of processed soy paste. He wasn't prime physical stock. Suddenly, the harsh lighting shifted. The heavy blast doors at the front of the hold ground open with a deafening screech of unlubricated metal. The red-marked Krell commander stepped forward. His voice, translated through the miserable little parasites in their ears, boomed through the room. "Silent salvage." The weeping and murmuring died down, replaced by a tense, suffocating quiet. You could hear the faint, erratic breathing of 400 terrified people. "I am Overseer Vrek of the Krell hegemony." The voice droned in Cole's head, flat and devoid of emotion. "Your vessel had been claimed under the salvage rights of the Outer Rim. Your species is unregistered, primitive, soft. You will serve as indentured labor in the volatile mining colonies of the Tartarus sector. Indentured labor, slaves." Vrek paced the edge of the platform, his heavy three-toed boots clanking against the metal. "Do not attempt resistance. Your biology is fragile. Your technology is archaic. You exist now only by the grace of the hegemony's need for expendable flesh." Cole looked at the Krell guards. His engineer's brain, previously paralyzed by shock, finally started to tick over. He looked at their weapons. The casings were scarred, patched with what looked like substandard welding. The red markings on Rek's armor were flaking off. Their boots were mismatched. These weren't the elite conquerors of the galaxy. They were scavengers. Desperate, ragged scavengers who had stumbled onto a gold mine and didn't realize they were holding a stick of dynamite. They thought the humans were just meat. They hadn't checked the ship's archives. They didn't know why the Borealis was floating in deep space, heavily armored, and broadcasting a quarantine signal on every known frequency. They didn't know humanity hadn't fled from an enemy. Humanity had locked itself away to protect everyone else from them. "Cole," Turner hissed, nudging him. "They're calling the next batch." A pair of Krell guards waded into the crowd, shoving people toward the sorting line. One of them grabbed a young girl, maybe 19, one of the hydroponics apprentices. She screamed, thrashing wildly. The Krell let out a short, clicking laugh and easily hoisted her off the ground by her hair. "Let her go!" a voice cracked. It was a kid, barely early 20s, skinny, shaking like a leaf. He stepped in front of the Krell, his fists raised in a pathetic, trembling boxer's stance. The Krell stopped. It tilted its head, observing the boy as if he were an amusing insect. Then, with terrifying speed, it swung the butt of its rifle. The impact sounded like a dropped melon. The boy was thrown backward, crashing into the steel deck. He didn't move. A pool of dark blood immediately began spreading from beneath his head, staining the gray metal. The hold went dead silent. Not the frightened silence from before. This was different. The weeping stopped. The shivering paused. 400 pairs of eyes stared at the bleeding boy on the floor, and then slowly shifted to the Krell guard. It was a subtle shift in the air. The smell of fear, the sour sweat, and urine was suddenly overpowered by something else. A dense electric tension. It was the atmospheric pressure dropping right before a hurricane. The Krell didn't notice. They were predators who had only ever hunted prey that ran. They didn't understand the terrible quiet math happening in the minds of the humans around them. Cole felt it in his own chest. The cold numbness was gone, replaced by a hot, tight knot right behind his sternum. He wasn't brave, he was still terrified. But underneath the terror was an ugly ancient spike of pure, unadulterated spite. "Keep moving," the translated voice of the guard buzzed in Cole's ear. He kicked the boy's limp body out of the way and reached for the girl again. He never touched her. It wasn't a coordinated attack. Nobody yelled a battle cry. The man standing to the guard's left, a massive guy named Henderson from Heavy Machinery, simply stepped forward. He didn't punch. He didn't grapple. He just drove his thumb directly into the soft, unarmored joint between the Krell's mandible and its neck plate. The alien let out a screech that sounded like tearing metal. It dropped its rifle, clawing frantically at Henderson's hand. Henderson didn't let go. His face was a mask of blank, terrifying concentration. He dug his grip deeper, twisting his wrist with the brutal efficiency of a man used to wrenching seized bolts. Thick yellow ichor sprayed across Henderson's chest, smelling sharply of sulfur. The guard collapsed its legs, kicking erratically before going still. Chaos didn't erupt. Violence simply optimized itself. The second guard raised his weapon, his mandibles clattering in panic. He fired. The kinetic slug tore through a woman's shoulder, spraying blood against the bulkhead. She fell screaming, but instead of scattering, the crowd surged. 10, maybe 15 people piled onto the shooter. They didn't have weapons. They used teeth nails, knees, and raw, frantic weight. The Creel's armor was tough, but its joints were weak points. Cole heard the sickening pop of chitin cracking under the sheer mass of desperate human bodies. Cole didn't join the pile. He scrambled backward, his bare feet slipping in the smear of blood on the deck. His heart was a jackhammer against his ribs. He bumped into a pillar, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Think, damn it. He looked at the platform. Overseer Rec was shouting orders, his weapon raised, firing indiscriminately into the crowd. People were dropping, but the sheer volume of the mob was pushing forward. It was a meat grinder, and the humans were throwing themselves into the gears just to jam them. Cole caught sight of a recessed maintenance panel on the pillar he was hiding behind. His hands trembling so hard he could barely form a fist slammed against the manual release latch. It was stuck, rusted shut from 10 millennia of disuse. "Move!" Cole yelled, shoving a terrified man out of his way. He kicked the latch with the heel of his foot, ignoring the agonizing pain that shot up his leg. The cover popped off, hitting the floor with a metallic clatter. Inside was a manual override terminal. Dust coated the keys, but the soft green glow of the archaic screen was the most beautiful thing Cole had ever seen. His fingers flew over the keyboard. It was pure muscle memory. He didn't have to think about the syntax. His hands remembered the dance. System override. Terminal auth Cole Jeffrey. Password redacted. Error network. Offline. "Come on, you piece of garbage," Cole hissed, wiping a mix of sweat and someone else's blood out of his eyes. A stray round struck the bulkhead a foot above his head, raining sparks down on his shoulders. The heat stung, but he didn't stop typing. He bypassed the central network, routing directly through the localized environmental controls. The Krell ship was docked to theirs. They had extended boarding tubes. That meant the Borealis's localized defense protocols designed to repel asteroid impacts and radiation spikes, not borders, were still viable. Command Ventral Lock 4, Atmosphere Purge, Thermal Exchange Overload. "What are you doing?" Turner screamed over the din. He was crouched beside Cole, clutching a heavy metal pipe he'd ripped from a broken handrail. "Giving them a sunburn," Cole muttered, hitting the execute key. Deep within the bowels of the Borealis, a heavy, subsonic vibration began. It wasn't loud, but it could be felt in the teeth. The Krell stopped shooting for a fraction of a second, feeling the deck plates hum beneath their boots. They looked down confused. They didn't know how human engines worked. They used clean, efficient fusion. Humanity used dirty, brutal, controlled explosions. And Cole had just opened the plasma venting manifolds directly into the boarding tubes. The blast doors at the end of the cargo hold blew outward. It wasn't a fire. It was a wave of pure, superheated plasma. It washed over the Krell guards standing near the entrance. They didn't even have time to scream. Their armor flashed white hot, and then they simply ceased to exist, turning into a cloud of glowing ash and popping fluids. The shockwave knocked everyone in the hold off their feet. Cole hit the deck hard, the breath driven from his lungs, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. The air temperature spiked violently. It felt like standing inside an oven. The stench of ozone and vaporized alien filled the hold. Cole pushed himself up onto his elbows, coughing violently. The front half of the cargo hold was scorched black. The Krell who had survived the blast were stumbling around their armor, smoking their weapons, warped and useless. Freck was on his knees, one of his articulated arms hanging loosely at his side. The armor charred away to reveal raw, blistered flesh. He looked up at the mob of naked, bruised, bleeding humans slowly rising from the floor. He didn't look arrogant anymore. He looked like a man who had kicked a hornet's nest only to discover the hornets were made of napalm. Cole forced himself to his feet, leaning heavily against the console. His shin was bleeding. His back ached, and he wanted nothing more than to curl up and sleep for another 10,000 years. But he looked at Rek, and he looked at the wrench Turner was holding. "Well," Cole said, his voice hoarse and rough, "I guess we're awake." Nobody cheered. If you've ever watched a vid-screen drama where the oppressed slaves rise up, kill their masters, and let out a triumphant roar, you've been lied to. Real violence doesn't leave room for triumph. It just leaves a mess. The silence that followed the plasma wash was thick, heavy, and nauseating. The only sounds were the crackle of cooling metal, the hiss of a ruptured pneumatic line somewhere in the ceiling, and the ragged, wet breathing of 400 terrified people coming down from an adrenaline high. Cole watched Henderson walk over to Overseer Rek. The Krell commander was trying to push himself up with his one good arm. His carapace was cracked, leaking that sulfur-smelling yellow ichor onto the deck plates. Henderson didn't say a word. He didn't offer a dramatic monologue. He just raised his heavy steel-toed work boot, one he'd scavenged from a dead maintenance worker, and brought it down on Rek's head. It sounded like a boot crushing a giant wet beetle. Cole turned away and vomited. It was mostly bile and the lingering taste of cryogel burning the back of his throat. He leaned against the terminal, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the console just to stay upright. The metal was still warm from the overload. "Cole." Turner was beside him. He had dropped the wrench. He was staring at his own hands, which were coated in a mix of red and yellow blood. "Cole, what did we just do?" "We survived," Cole managed to say, wiping his mouth with the back of a trembling arm. "For about 5 minutes." The reality of their situation was settling in like a physical weight. They were naked, freezing malnourished, and trapped on a crippled sleeper ship. They had just murdered a boarding party. That meant there was a ship attached to the other end of that boarding tube, and whoever was on it was going to wonder why Rek wasn't answering his radio. Cole forced himself to stand straight, his bare feet squelching slightly on the deck. "Listen up," he yelled, his voice cracked raw and pathetic. He cleared his throat and tried again, pulling from the diaphragm the way a drill sergeant once taught him. "Listen up!" Heads turned, hollow, shocked eyes stared at him. They didn't see a leader. They saw the guy who just happened to be standing next to a keyboard. "They're coming back," Cole said, his voice echoing off the scorched bulkheads. "We have maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. Grab whatever you can. Clothes off the dead crew. Blankets. Weapons." Nobody moved for a long second. Then an older woman, Barrett, from internal security stepped forward. She was wrapped in a foil emergency blanket, her gray hair plastered to her skull with sweat. She walked over to the nearest dead Krell, knelt down in the gore, and began prying the heavy kinetic rifle from its stiffening claws. That broke the spell. The crowd descended on the dead aliens like starving dogs. It was a miserable, degrading sight. People weeping openly as they stripped coveralls from human corpses, trying not to look at the faces of former friends. Others were frantically trying to figure out how to unbuckle the Krell armor plating. Cole hobbled over to Rex's crushed corpse. The smell of roasted meat and ozone was suffocating. He didn't want the alien's gun. He wanted his comms. He knelt, ignoring the wet stickiness soaking into his bare knees, and dug his fingers into the rigid collar of the armor. He found a small rectangular device wired into the side of the helmet. Cole yanked it hard. Wires snapped, sparking faintly. "What's that?" Turner asked, coming up behind him. He had managed to find a pair of oversized, blood-stained cargo pants. He looked absurd and terrified. "Translation matrix and shortwave," Cole said, turning the device over in his hands. It was surprisingly heavy, warm to the touch, encased in a matte black resin. "If I can splice this into the Borealis internal comms, I might be able to hear what the ship next door is saying." "You want to listen to them? I want to know how many there are," Cole said, pushing himself up. His bad shin throbbed a vicious rhythmic ache. "And I need to know if they're prepping to uncouple and blow us to dust." "They won't blow us up," Barrett said, walking over. She had a Krell rifle slung awkwardly over her shoulder and a heavy pistol gripped in her right hand. The weapon was too big for her. Her finger barely reached the trigger. "Vrek called us salvage, expendable flesh. They want the ship, and they want us alive to dig rocks. You don't vaporize a payday." She was right. The sheer cold economics of the universe might be the only thing keeping them breathing. "All right," Cole said, looking at the scorched hole where the blast doors used to be. The boarding tube beyond was dark, filled with drifting smoke. "Turner, you're with me. We need to get to the security node in Sector 3. Barrett, take whoever can hold a gun and set up a bottleneck at the entrance. If anything comes through that tube, you make it bleed." Barrett nodded, her jaw set in a hard line. "What about the rest of them?" She gestured to the hundreds of shivering people huddling in the back of the hold. "Tell them to hide," Cole said, turning away before he had to look at their faces. "Just tell them to hide." The corridors of the Borealis felt different. Before the freeze, they smelled of recycled air floor wax and faint hints of cafeteria soy calf. Now they smelled like a tomb that had been violently cracked open. The air was stale and freezing, the emergency lighting, casting long, sickly shadows across the stamped steel bulkheads. Cole was wearing a dead man's boots. They were a size too big and chafed his heels with every step. He had a stained mechanic's jumpsuit zipped up to his neck, freezing against his clammy skin. Turner walked beside him, his scavenged pipe gripped so tightly his knuckles were white. They were accompanied by two others, a young kid named Hayes from Waste Management, carrying a Krell pistol like it was a live snake, and a stoic hydroponics worker named O'Connor, who had somehow found a fire axe. They weren't an elite squad. They were four terrified mechanics playing soldier. They reached the security node. The heavy door was sealed, but the localized power was dead. Cole had to manually crank the hydraulic release. It took 5 agonizing minutes of sweating and cursing, his muscles screaming in protest. When the door finally hissed open, they spilled into the room, gasping for breath. The node was a mess. The Krell had clearly been there. Terminals were smashed, display screens shattered. "Damn it," Cole muttered, sliding into the main operator's chair. The leather was cold. He cracked his knuckles, a nervous habit, and started pulling panels off the console, looking for an intact data line. "Can you fix it?" Turner asked, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "It's not broken, it's just disconnected." Cole grunted, stripping the end of a fiber optic cable with his teeth. It tasted like plastic and copper dust. "They bashed the screens, but the localized mainframe is shielded under the floorboards. Brute force doesn't work on decentralized architecture." He spliced the Krell communicator he'd ripped from Vrek into their audio feed, bypassing the ruined visual displays. He routed the power, held his breath, and flipped the breaker. Static hissed through the room's overhead speakers, loud and aggressive. Then a voice cut through. It was guttural, harsh, and heavily filtered through the translation matrix. "Repeat, Overseer Rek. Report status of Hold C. Atmospheric anomaly detected. Vrek, acknowledge." Cole looked at Turner. He swallowed hard. "Vrek!" The voice barked again, sounding agitated. "Telemetry shows a thermal spike in the umbilical. Did the bipeds detonate a fuel cell respond immediately, or I am initiating the Sever sequence?" "Sever sequence," Hayes whispered, his eyes wide. "They're going to detach." If they detached while the umbilical was compromised, the sudden depressurization would rip the Borealis apart. They didn't have main power to raise the emergency bulkheads in time. "No, they're bluffing," Cole said, his fingers flying over the physical keyboard, pulling up the ship's docking telemetry on a cracked backup screen. "They clamped onto us mechanically. Their ship's docking clamps are drilled into our hull. If they detach without a localized release from our side, they'll tear the ass end off their own ship." "Are you sure?" O'Connor asked, his grip tightening on the fire axe. "I'm an engineer, O'Connor. It's the only thing I am sure of." Cole stared at the green text scrolling across the cracked glass. "But they don't know that we know that. They think we're primitives." Cole keyed the microphone. The plastic switch felt slick with his sweat. "Krell vessel," he said. His voice sounded tiny in the quiet room. He didn't try to sound tough. He just sounded tired. "This is Jeffrey Cole, acting engineer of the Borealis. Overseer Rek is dead." Silence stretched over the comms. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. "Identify yourself," the alien voice finally responded. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, metallic caution. "I just did," Cole said. "You're boarded to a Class 4 heavy industrial sleeper ship. We are carrying 4,000 metric tons of refined promethium in our lower holds. If you try to uncouple your clamps by force, the friction shear will spark the promethium. We will become a localized sun, and you will be sitting right next to the match." It was a lie. Humanity burned its promethium reserves 3,000 years ago before going to sleep. The lower holds were full of empty barrels and frozen sewage. But the Krell scanners couldn't penetrate the heavy lead lining of the engineering deck. "You are bluffing, biped," the voice sneered. "Your species is archaic." "Maybe," Cole said, leaning back in the chair. "But my thumb is hovering over the manual release for the primary fusion vent. You want to test the structural integrity of your hull against a directed plasma burst because your boarding party already failed that test." More silence. "What do you want?" the Krell commander finally asked. Cole looked at the three men standing around him. They were bruised, battered, and trembling. They were the absolute worst humanity had to offer at that exact moment in time. "I want your ship," Cole said. Turner let out a strangled cough. Hayes looked like he was going to pass out. "You are insane," the Krell replied. A harsh clicking sound followed laughter. "You are trapped in a dead shell. We have 50 armed soldiers aboard the Sketh. We will breach your bulkheads, slaughter your workers, and take the ship from your corpses." "Come and get it then," Cole said, and smashed his fist down on the comms console, shattering the plastic housing and severing the connection. "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" Turner exploded, grabbing Cole's shoulder. "You just declared war on a ship full of armed aliens." "They were already at war with us, Turner." Cole shoved his hand away, his heart hammering against his ribs. "They were going to turn us into slaves. They have 50 guys. We have 400. 400 naked, starving civilians, and a ship full of heavy industrial equipment," Cole countered, pulling up the Borealis schematics on the flickering screen. He wasn't acting out of bravery. He was acting out of pure cornered panic. When a rat is backed into a corner, it doesn't calculate the odds. It just bites. "Look," he pointed at the screen. "Their ship, the Sketh, is docked at Ventral Lock 4. They're relying on our life support because their umbilical bypassed their outer airlock. If we can get a team into that tube, bypass the secondary seal, and hit their atmospheric scrubbers." "We gas them," O'Connor said softly, the fire axe resting against his leg. "We don't have gas," Cole said, "but we have industrial coolants, liquid nitrogen freon derivatives. If we pump that through their ventilation system, we drop the temperature on their ship to -40 degrees in about 3 minutes. He looked at the dead Krell armor plating they had scavenged. "They evolved on a hot world. Look at their carapace. No thermal insulation. They're giant bugs. What happens to bugs when it gets cold?" "They go to sleep," Hayes whispered. "Exactly. But we need to manually tap the feed line into their ship's manifold, from the inside." Cole looked at the three of them. There was no glory in this. It was a suicide run into a hostile alien vessel, armed with stolen guns and plumbing equipment. "I need a wrench," Cole said, pushing himself out of the chair. "A big one." The boarding tube was a nightmare. It was a flexible ribbed corridor made of some alien polymer that felt uncomfortably like dried skin. The floor was spongy, absorbing the sound of their footsteps. The air was stiflingly hot, smelling of burnt hair and sour chemicals. The emergency lights from their side cast long, bloody hues down the throat of the tunnel. Cole was at the front, carrying a heavy plasma torch and a coil of high-pressure hosing slung over his shoulder. It dug into his collarbone, heavy and awkward. Behind him, O'Connor held his axe, and Turner had the scavenged kinetic rifle, raised his finger, trembling on the trigger guard. Hayes was in the rear, watching their backs with wide, panicked eyes. 50 meters, Cole whispered, glancing at the crude digital readout he'd rigged to his wrist. The airlock interface should be right ahead. They moved slowly. The texture of the alien ship was jarring. Where human engineering relied on right angles, stamped steel, and exposed wiring, the Krell vessel was organic. The walls curved inward like the ribs of a leviathan. Conduits pulsed faintly beneath translucent amber-colored resin. It felt like walking through the intestines of a massive beast. They reached the airlock. It wasn't a door. It was a sphincter-like valve made of interlocking metallic plates. "It's locked," Turner whispered, pushing against the plates. They didn't budge. "Step back," Cole muttered, unhooking the plasma torch. He didn't try to hack the keypad. He didn't look for an access port. He just sparked the torch. The blue-white flame hissed violently to life, casting harsh shadows against the ribbed walls. He pressed the flame against the locking mechanism. The alien metal hissed and bubbled, glowing cherry red, then blinding white. Slag dripped onto the spongy floor, burning small, smoking holes into the deck. Clank. The internal latch warped and snapped. The sphincter valve shuddered and slowly ground open, revealing the dim, sickly purple lighting of the Sketh's interior corridor. "Move," Cole hissed, shutting off the torch and dropping it. They stepped into the alien ship. The air here was different. Thicker. It smelled strongly of sulfur and something sweet like rotting fruit. The temperature was sweltering easily 40 degrees Celsius. Sweat instantly beaded on Cole's forehead, stinging his eyes. "Which way?" O'Connor asked, his voice tight. "Life support node should be central," Cole said, tapping his wrist display. "Follow the main environmental trunk." They crept down the corridor. Every shadow looked like a Krell soldier. Every hum of the alien engines sounded like a weapon charging. Cole's chest was tight, his breathing shallow. He wanted to be back in his cryopod. He wanted to be numb. They rounded a curve in the corridor and nearly walked straight into a Krell patrol. There were two of them. They weren't wearing the heavy armor of the boarding party. They wore lighter segmented vests. They were holding elongated devices that glowed with a faint purple energy. For a fraction of a second time, stopped. The humans stared at them. They stared at the humans. Cole registered the intricate patterns on their mandibles, the wet sheen of their black compound eyes. Then Turner screamed and pulled the trigger. The heavy kinetic rifle bucked violently in his hands. He hadn't braced it properly. The first shot went wild, tearing a chunk of resin out of the ceiling. The second shot hit the Krell on the left square in the chest. The impact lifted the massive alien off its feet, throwing it backward against the bulkhead. Yellow ichor sprayed across the purple-lit walls. The second Krell didn't flinch. It raised its weapon. A beam of searing violet light lanced down the corridor. It hit Hayes. The kid didn't even have time to scream. The beam struck him in the stomach. There was a sound like tearing canvas and a horrific stench of flash-boiled blood. Hayes folded in half, dropping his pistol, and collapsed onto the spongy deck. "Hayes!" Turner yelled. O'Connor didn't hesitate. With a guttural roar, he charged. The Krell swung its weapon toward O'Connor, but the tight confines of the corridor worked against its long reach. O'Connor closed the distance in 2 strides. He swung the fire axe in a brutal horizontal arc. The heavy steel blade bit deep into the unarmored joint of the Krell's leg. The alien screeched, its leg collapsing under its weight. O'Connor wrenched the axe free and brought it down again, burying it in the creature's thorax. The Krell twitched violently, its mandibles clicking in a frantic rhythm, and then went still. The silence rushed back in deafening. Cole looked at Hayes. He was dead. His eyes were wide, staring blankly at the ribbed ceiling. The hole in his torso was cauterized black and smoking. Cole felt a cold numbness wash over him. It wasn't shock. It was a bizarre, terrible clarity. The terror was gone, burned away by the sheer, ugly reality of the corpse at his feet. Cole. Turner gasped, dropping to his knees beside Hayes. He was shaking violently. "Cole, he's—" "Leave him," Cole said. His voice didn't sound like his own. It sounded hollow, scraped out. "We don't have time." "He's a kid, Cole," Turner yelled, tears streaking his soot-stained face. "He's meat, Turner," Cole snapped, the anger finally flaring hot and bright in his chest. "Just like Rex said, if we don't finish this, we're all meat. Now get up." He grabbed Turner by the collar of his scavenged jacket and hauled him to his feet. He shoved the coil of high-pressure hosing into his chest. "Carry this. We're close." Cole didn't look at Hayes again. He stepped over his body and kept walking. They found the environmental manifold 50 meters down the hall. It was a massive pulsing column of translucent amber, thick veins of glowing fluid pumping through it. "This is it," Cole muttered, dropping to his knees. He pulled a heavy wrench from his belt and started slamming it against the resin casing. The material was tough but brittle. After 3 solid hits, it cracked, exposing the central ventilation intake. "Give me the hose," he demanded, holding his hand out. Turner handed it over his hands, slick with sweat. Cole shoved the brass nozzle of the high-pressure line directly into the Krell air intake, twisting it violently until the threads caught. "O'Connor," Cole said, looking at the stoic man. He was covered in alien blood, leaning heavily on his axe. "Go back to the airlock. Tell Barrett to open the primary coolant valves on the Borealis side. Maximum pressure." O'Connor nodded once and sprinted back down the hall. Cole keyed his wrist comms. "Barrett, it's Cole. We're tapped in. Hit it." "Copy that, Cole." Barrett's voice crackled through the static. "Purging coolant lines now." The heavy rubber hose in Cole's hands bucked violently as pressurized liquid nitrogen surged through it. The brass nozzle frosted over, instantly turning white with rime. Inside the amber column, the glowing fluid stuttered. A thick white fog began to billow out of the Krell ventilation grates lining the ceiling. The ambient temperature in the corridor began to plummet. The sweltering heat vanished, replaced by a biting synthetic winter. The spongy walls seemed to contract, groaning under the sudden thermal shock. Cole sat back against the bulkhead, shivering as the frost spread across his scavenged boots. He looked at Turner. His breath was puffing out in white clouds. "It's working," Turner whispered. "Yeah," Cole said, closing his eyes. His bad leg was a throbbing knot of agony, and the smell of roasted meat still clung to the back of his throat. Deep within the ship, alarms began to wail. But over the sirens they could hear another sound, a slow, sluggish chorus of heavy bodies collapsing to the floor. The Krell weren't dying. They were just going to sleep, and humanity was just waking up. The cold didn't just seep into the sketh, it slammed into it like a physical wall. Within 10 minutes, the thick, sweltering air of the alien corridor turned brittle. The ambient moisture from the ship's organic life support system flash froze, coating the walls, the spongy floor, and the ribbed ceiling in a thick layer of jagged white rime. The ship began to scream. It wasn't a mechanical alarm. It was the sound of the alien resin contracting too fast, popping and fracturing under the extreme thermal shock. It sounded like a forest of dry timber snapping in a gale. Cole couldn't feel his toes anymore. The dead man's boots he wore offered zero thermal protection. Every step felt like he was walking on blocks of wood. He kept his hands tucked into his armpits, his teeth chattering so hard he tasted blood where he'd accidentally bitten his tongue. "Keep moving," he mumbled, his voice swallowed by the thick freezing fog rolling off the deck. "If we stop, we're not waking up." Turner was shivering violently, the scavenged kinetic rifle hanging limply from his hands. O'Connor was a few paces behind them, a ghost in the vapor dragging his fire axe. The blade scraped against the frozen deck, a sharp metallic screech that set Cole's teeth on edge. They found the first Krell 100 meters past the environmental manifold. It was a soldier, heavily armored. It hadn't died from the cold. It had simply shut down. The creature was curled into a tight fetal ball against the bulkhead, its 4 articulated arms wrapped around its thorax mandibles, locked together. A thick layer of frost covered its dark carapace. Cole stopped staring down at the massive, terrifying thing that had been executing his friends less than an hour ago. It looked small now, pathetic almost. Turner stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen floor. He raised the barrel of the kinetic rifle, pressing it directly against the seam of the Krell's helmet. His hands were shaking, whether from the cold or the adrenaline, Cole couldn't tell. "Don't," Cole rasped, putting a stiff, numb hand on the barrel of his gun. "It's asleep. Don't waste the ammo. It killed Hayes," Turner whispered, his voice cracking. A tear leaked from his eye and immediately froze onto his cheek. "It killed that kid." "And the cold is killing it," Cole said. "Save the rounds for the ones with heaters." They pushed forward. The Sketh was a graveyard of hibernating giants. They passed dozens of them in the main transit arteries. Some had tried to run toward the docking umbilical, collapsing mid-stride, as their internal body temperatures plummeted below critical thresholds. Their alien biology, evolved under a scorching binary sun, simply possessed no defense mechanism against liquid nitrogen. The command center was at the prow of the ship. They knew they had reached it because the heavy blast-proof doors were sealed shut, and the resin around the frame was warm to the touch. They had localized thermal generators. They were holding out. Cole pressed his ear against the freezing metal of the door. Faintly through the thick plating, he could hear rapid, agitated clicking and the low hum of power cells. "They're awake in there," he whispered, stepping back. He looked at the crude locking mechanism. It was a heavy magnetic seal. "O'Connor, the axe isn't going to cut it. We need to pry the access panel, but my hands are useless." O'Connor didn't speak. He stepped up to the wall, wedged the heavy steel blade of the axe into the seam of the wall panel, and leaned his entire muscular weight onto the handle. The frozen resin groaned, cracked, and then shattered like glass. Inside was a nest of glowing amber-colored cables. "Cut them," Cole said. O'Connor swung the axe. Sparks showered the freezing corridor as the heavy blade severed the primary power feeds. The magnetic seal on the door died with a heavy, satisfying thunk. "Turner," Cole breathed, pulling the Krell pistol he'd taken from Hayes' body out of his waistband. It felt like a block of ice. "On 3, we push, we shoot the heaters, and we let the cold do the rest." Turner nodded, his jaw locked. O'Connor dropped his axe, wedged his thick, frostbitten fingers into the crack of the blast doors, and dug his boots into the deck. "1," Cole whispered. He thought about the cryo bay, the sound of Davis's ribs snapping. 2. He thought about the smell of vaporized alien, the metallic tang of his own blood. 3. Push. O'Connor roared a raw, primal sound and threw his back into the door. It ground open just enough for a man to slip through. Cole went first. The heat inside the bridge hit him like a physical blow, sweltering and thick with the stench of panicked Krell. There were 4 of them. 3 guards in heavy armor and 1 older, scarred Krell standing by the central bio-console, the shipmaster. In the center of the room, a heavy industrial thermal coil was glowing white-hot, holding the cold at bay. The guards turned, raising their kinetic rifles. They expected a squad of armored Marines. They got a freezing, half-naked mechanic. Cole didn't aim at them. He raised the Krell pistol, pointed it directly at the white-hot thermal coil, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon bucked, sending a bolt of purple plasma across the room. It struck the coil dead center. The generator violently overloaded, exploding in a shower of molten slag and sparks. The shockwave threw Cole backward against the blast door. Instantly, the pressurized -40-degree air from the corridor howled into the sweltering bridge like a physical entity. The temperature crashed in seconds. The Krell guards opened fire, but the sudden blinding fog of condensation ruined their aim. Slugs tore into the walls around Cole, shattering the displays. Turner stepped through the gap, blind firing into the mist. One of the Krell shrieked a wet tearing sound and collapsed. Cole scrambled on his hands and knees across the deck, slipping in puddles of rapidly freezing condensation. He could see the shipmaster looming over him through the fog. He didn't have a rifle. He drew a heavy serrated blade from his hip and lunged. Cole rolled onto his back, kicking out with both legs. His oversized boots caught the alien square in its armored knee. The joint snapped backward with a sound like a rifle crack. The shipmaster fell heavy, his blade skittering across the deck. He reached for Cole's throat with two of his remaining arms, his mandibles spread wide, a hiss of pure hatred vibrating in his chest. His grip closed around Cole's windpipe. It was like being caught in a hydraulic vise. Cole gasped, his vision swimming with dark spots. He brought the Krell pistol up and jammed the muzzle directly into its compound eye. "Sleep," he choked out and pulled the trigger. The bridge of the Sketh went dead silent, save for the hiss of the freezing wind pouring through the cracked door. Cole shoved the shipmaster's massive headless weight off him and lay on the deck, coughing violently, sucking in the freezing air. His throat felt bruised and crushed. Turner was standing over one of the guards, his rifle lowered. O'Connor was slumped against the wall, clutching a shallow graze on his bicep where a stray round had clipped him. "Clear!" Turner rasped, his voice trembling. "It's clear, Cole." They had done it. 3 malnourished mechanics armed with scavenged guns and a garden hose had taken an alien warship. Cole pushed himself up his joints, popping in protest. The ambient temperature in the bridge was dropping fast, the frost already creeping up the bulkheads. "Block the door," he croaked. "Seal the gap with something. If we freeze in here, this was all for nothing." O'Connor nodded, grabbing the heavy desk chair of the dead shipmaster and wedging it into the door track before pulling a heavy emergency thermal blanket from a nearby locker and stuffing it into the remaining gap. It wasn't perfect, but it slowed the draft. Cole dragged himself toward the central console. It was a massive, sweeping crescent of organic resin and glowing bioluminescent displays. He didn't know how to read Krell's syntax, but engineering is engineering. Power routing life support databanks, they all follow a logical flow no matter what species built them. He dug into his pocket and pulled out the translation matrix he'd ripped from Rex's helmet. With numb, clumsy fingers, he stripped the wires on a localized data port on the console, spliced the matrix in, and linked it to his wrist pad. Syncing. His wrist pad blinked green. English text began to scroll across his tiny, cracked screen, translating the massive flow of data pouring from the Sketh's central mainframe. Turner. Cole set his eyes glued to the screen. "Get Barrett on the comms. Tell her to shut off the coolant purge. The ship is secure. Tell her to send a detail over with plasma torches to start cutting the frozen Krell out of the corridors. Throw them out the airlock. I don't want them waking up." "Copy," Turner said, pulling his scavenged comms unit. Cole leaned over the console, tapping the controls to access the ship's navigational and historical archives. He needed to know where they were. He needed to know what the year was. And most importantly, He needed to know who the Krell hegemony was. The data poured in, converting into a harsh staccato English on his screen. The Krell hegemony wasn't an empire. Not really. They were a minor syndicate, a group of opportunistic scavengers operating on the very edge of the galactic Perseus arm. They survived by mining volatile asteroids and raiding dead systems. He pulled up the star chart. The galaxy was mapped out in intricate glowing detail. Thousands of populated systems, vast trade routes, massive empires colored in different shades of neon light. And then he saw it. Right on the outer rim of the Orion Spur, there was a massive spherical void on the map. No trade routes passed through it. No inhabited worlds were listed. It was simply marked with a dense, blinking red border. Cole tapped the void on the screen. The translation matrix lagged for a second before spitting out the text. Warning Quarantine Zone. O1, Sol Sector. Threat level Omega. Entry strictly forbidden by decree of the Galactic Concordat. He frowned, scrolling down. The logs were open to the public network. It wasn't a secret. The entire galaxy knew about this zone. Subject species humanity. Status self-contained. History. Classified access denied. Cole gritted his teeth. He bypassed the Krell's civilian firewall. It was pathetically weak built for keeping out minor hackers, not a pissed-off systems engineer from Earth. He cracked the military encryption on the Krell's databanks, pulling up their own internal briefings on the quarantine zone. Subject the Borealis salvage claim. Log Overseer Vrek. We have located a massive unpowered vessel drifting on the edge of the dead zone. Scans indicate millions of tons of refined industrial materials. Buoys warn of a Class 9 aggressive species. The buoys are 10 millennia old. The Concordat are cowards, frightened of ghosts. We will crack the vault. If the species still lives, they will serve the hegemony. They didn't know. The Krell were too arrogant and too stupid to read the history. Cole dug deeper. He found the original Galactic Concordat broadcasts from 10,000 years ago. He wanted to see who attacked humanity. He wanted to see the terrible alien armada that had forced them to build sleeper ships, poison their own atmosphere, and hide in the ice. The audio file began to play through his wrist pad. It was a human voice. It was an old recording filled with static, but the words were clear. This is Earth Command. To all listening species. We have ceased our advance. We have seen the ash of the Centauri cluster. We have seen the glassed plains of Sirius. We have looked at our hands, and we cannot wash the blood away. Cole's blood ran cold. The freezing air in the bridge had nothing to do with it. His heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. We are a plague. The voice continued ragged and broken. Our biology demands expansion. Our psychology demands conflict. We cannot exist among you without consuming you. The peace treaties do not work. The genetic tailoring did not hold. We are a weapon that cannot be unfired. Turner walked up behind him, looking over his shoulder. He was silent. We have enacted the sleep, the ancient human said. We are locking ourselves away. We leave the automated defenses to keep you out, not to protect us, but to protect you. Do not open the vaults. Do not wake us up. Let us dream until the universe goes cold. The recording clicked off. Cole stared at the black screen. The reflection staring back at him was a man with sunken eyes, a bruised face, and hands coated in dried yellow blood. He looked at Turner. He looked like a murderer. They hadn't been hiding from a monster. They were the monster. Humanity put itself in a cage because they realized they couldn't stop killing. And the Krell in their infinite greed had just picked the lock. Cole, Turner whispered, his voice trembling with a new kind of terror. If the galaxy knows that, then they know the demons just got out of hell, Cole said, his voice hollow. He looked down at the console. The Sketh was a mining frigate, but it had a localized warp drive. It had weapons, and it was just the first. They had 400 angry, desperate people awake, and another 90,000 still in cryo-sleep down in the Borealis. They woke up freezing, terrified, and naked. And within an hour, they had slaughtered a boarding party, disabled an alien warship, and taken control of their command center. The ancient broadcast was right. Their psychology demanded conflict. They optimized violence. "Get Barrett on the line," Cole said, his voice hardening. The fear was gone. It had been replaced by a grim, metallic certainty. "Tell her to start waking up the rest of the crew. Engineers first, then the security details. We're going to strip this Krell ship for parts, patch the Borealis, and weaponize the cargo holds." "Weaponize?" Turner asked, pale. "We can't go back to sleep, Turner. The cycle is broken. The Krell broadcast their salvage claim. Somebody in the galaxy heard it, and they know the quarantine is breached." Cole turned back to the Krell comms array. "They're going to come to put the dogs back in the cage. We need to make sure we have teeth when they get here." 3 hours later, the Borealis was unrecognizable. The sheer terrifying efficiency of human desperation had taken over. The remaining 400 awakened crew members had swarmed the frozen Sketh like ants dismantling a dead beetle. Under Barrett's ruthless direction, they dragged the frozen heavy bodies of the Krell crew to the airlocks and vented them into the void of space. They stripped the alien ship of thermal generators, kinetic rifles, plasma cells, and ration packs. They weren't crying anymore. The shock had worn off, leaving behind a cold, mechanical focus. Cole watched a group of hydroponics technicians, people whose only job used to be trimming soy stalks, dismantle a heavy Krell turret from the Sketh's hull, using plasma cutters, hauling it piece by piece through the boarding tube to mount it inside their own cargo hold. Cole sat in the shipmaster's chair on the bridge of the Sketh. He was finally warm. Someone had brought him a thermal fleece from the emergency lockers and a mug of lukewarm recycled water. It tasted like heaven. His wrist pad was hardwired into the Krell deep space communications array. "Cole." Barrett's voice crackled over the local channel. "We have the primary umbilical sealed. Environmental controls on the Borealis are stable. The engineering team says they can splice the Krell warp core into our sublight engines. Give us a week and we can make the sleeper ship jump." "Good," Cole said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His shin throbbed with a dull, constant ache. "Wake up the medical staff next. We have casualties that need tending, and start compiling an inventory of every weapon we pulled off this ship." "Understood," Barrett replied. She sounded completely detached, professional, deadly. It was terrifying how fast they adapted. Cole looked out the massive forward viewport of the Krell bridge. The stars of the Perseus arm hung in the blackness, bright and completely indifferent to the tiny bloody drama unfolding in their little corner of the void. 10,000 years ago, humanity looked at those stars and decided they didn't deserve them. They recognized the darkness in their own DNA and voluntarily locked themselves in a sensory deprivation tank. They tried to be the good guys by removing themselves from the board, but the universe doesn't respect the good guys. The universe only respects leverage. The Krell didn't care about their noble sacrifice. They saw weakness, and they exploited it. Cole reached out and flipped the heavy physical toggle on the Krell comms board. He routed the signal through their hyperwave relay, setting it to broadcast on every open galactic frequency unencrypted. He used the Concordate's own warning buoys as signal boosters. He didn't prepare a speech. He didn't want to sound like a politician or a warlord. He just wanted to tell the truth. He leaned toward the microphone. To the Galactic Concordate, to the Krell hegemony, to whoever is listening. His voice echoed slightly in the quiet, frost-stained bridge. This is Jeffrey Cole, acting engineer of the Earth sleeper vessel Borealis. 10,000 years ago, we left you a warning. We told you not to knock on our door. We told you we were broken, and we asked to be left alone. He paused, listening to the hum of the alien ship beneath his boots. A few hours ago, the Krell hegemony ignored that warning. They breached our hull. They murdered our people. They tried to chain us. He looked down at the bloodstains frozen into the deck. The Krell vessel Sketh has been neutralized. Their crew has been jettisoned. We are taking their technology. We are waking up our brothers and sisters. And we are learning how to fight all over again. Cole took a slow, deep breath. We tried to be peaceful. We literally went to the ends of the universe and buried ourselves in ice to keep you safe from us. But you couldn't leave it alone. You had to have the salvage. So the quarantine is over. We are awake. We don't want your territory. We don't want your trade routes. But if any ship, military, civilian, or scavenger crosses into the Sol sector, he leaned closer to the mic, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. We will not ask questions. We will not take prisoners. You wanted the monsters. You got them. Stay away. He slammed his fist down on the console, cutting the transmission. The silence that followed was absolute. He sat back in the alien chair, staring out at the infinite dark. Humanity was awake, and the galaxy was going to burn. He just had to make sure they were the ones holding the matches. What an explosive finale to the awakening of the Borealis humanity has shattered its own chains and sent a terrifying message to the stars. The quarantine is broken, and the galaxy is about to learn why they were locked away. If you enjoyed this dark, gritty HFY sci-fi story, hit that like button, share it with your fellow sci-fi fans, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an adventure. Drop a comment below. What alien empire should Jeffrey Cole and the awakened humanity face off against next?